The chamber was heavy with tension, the kind that presses against your chest before a storm breaks. Rows of polished wooden desks gleamed under the harsh white lights, cameras clicked like a chorus of locusts, and the nation leaned in from afar, waiting for another hearing that promised to be anything but ordinary. In the middle of it all sat Judge Amy Coney Barrett, her expression sharpened into the calm, unyielding steel of someone used to commanding the room. And opposite her, steady yet resolute, was Representative Jasmine Crockett, prepared to challenge not only Barrett's words but the authority behind them. Crockett's voice cut through the stale air with conviction, threading her points with the kind of clarity that could not be ignored. She was mid-sentence, building momentum, when Barrett leaned forward, interrupting with a raised hand and a clipped tone. The move was abrupt, almost surgical, a dismissal masquerading as authority. "Representative, that's not relevant," Barrett declared, her words ringing with the cold assurance of someone who had silenced critics before. The room shifted. Staffers glanced up, reporters scribbled faster, and the camera zoomed closer. The power play was clear. Stop Crockett before her words gained full flight. But Crockett did not flinch. She didn't raise her voice, didn't match the interruption with fury. Instead, she paused, the silence itself daring Barrett to hold her ground. In that stillness, the arrogance of privilege met the unbreakable dignity of resistance. Crockett's eyes locked on Barrett's, unblinking, calm, but burning with an intensity that signaled she would not be reduced to silence. Every person in the room felt it. The weight of history colliding in a single stare-down, the struggle of representation versus exclusion playing out in real time. Reporters later described the moment as electric. You could almost hear the heartbeat of the crowd, waiting to see if Crockett would back down or surge forward. Barrett had attempted to clip her wings, but the pause only gave Crockett's words more power. It was as though she was gathering the very air in the room, shaping it into something unforgettable. And then, with composure unshaken, Crockett prepared to deliver the sentence that would not only reclaim her voice but send shockwaves far beyond those four walls. No one in that room expected what came next, but her words would echo across America. The clash between Amy Coney Barrett and Jasmine Crockett was not just another exchange inside the marble walls of Washington. It was a collision of two Americas, one that sought to preserve a narrow hierarchy of power and one that fought to expand the promise of representation to every voice, every identity, every citizen who had been told they didn't belong. This was why the interruption mattered. It wasn't merely about parliamentary procedure or courtroom decorum. It was about who gets to speak, who is allowed to be heard, and who is constantly told to wait their turn. Barrett entered this hearing with the air of established authority, her conservative legacy already cemented in history. To her supporters, she was the symbol of judicial restraint and moral guardianship. But to millions of Americans, she represented something else, the embodiment of a system that elevates privilege while dismissing dissent. Her tone, her timing, her insistence on shutting Crockett down carried the weight of decades, centuries of silencing. It was the quiet arrogance of a power structure that believed it could define the boundaries of truth without challenge. Crockett, by contrast, did not come draped in the robes of establishment comfort. She was not the polished symbol of the ruling order, but the product of struggle, resilience, and fire. Rising out of Texas, her voice carried not only her own conviction, but the echoes of communities long ignored. She was unapologetic, unfiltered, unwilling to dilute her words to appease those who had never walked in her shoes. In the halls where compromise too often dulled courage, Crockett stood out as a truth-teller who would not bow. The hearing room became more than a stage. It became a mirror. To progressives, immigrants, women, and people of color watching at home, this was not just Crockett being interrupted. It was them. It was every time a woman's point was brushed aside, every time a young activist was told to be respectful, Every time a worker, a voter, a dreamer was told they had no place at the table. Barrett's attempt to silence was personal, and Crockett's poised defiance promised to be universal. The tension rippled outward. Social media feeds lit up in real time, with viewers tweeting clips of Barrett's sharp cutoff. Outrage swelled. There it is again, power trying to erase truth. Others waited, watching Crockett's measured silence, sensing that something more was coming. It was the anticipation before the strike, the stillness that precedes thunder. For Barrett, the interruption was routine, just another way to assert control. But for Crockett, it became an opening, a chance to not only finish her point, but to flip the balance of power in the room, to show that truth does not need permission to speak, and that dignity cannot be muted by authority's raised hand. This moment was about more than words on the record. It was about identity, belonging, and who would shape the story America told about itself. Crockett's next sentence was not simply going to continue her testimony, it was going to ignite a conversation that spilled beyond Washington's walls, into households, feeds, and hearts across the country. Viewers at home leaned forward, waiting for the inevitable clash. They knew instinctively Crockett wasn't going to retreat. She was going to strike. But the real turning point hadn't even begun. To understand the weight of this confrontation, one has to understand Amy Coney Barrett, not simply as a judge, not merely as a name etched into the annals of the Supreme Court, but as a figure carefully sculpted by the machinery of power. From the moment she was nominated, Barrett was held up as the darling of conservative America, the symbol of a new era of judicial dominance. Her confirmation, rushed through in the final days of the Trump presidency, was not just about filling a seat. It was about entrenching an ideology, locking in a vision of America where authority flowed downward, never outward. Barrett's rise carried the sheen of legitimacy, her credentials impeccable, her demeanor composed, her tone cool and measured. She positioned herself as a neutral arbiter of the law, someone who would apply the Constitution as written, untouched by bias or ideology. But beneath that polished exterior lived contradictions impossible to ignore. For all her claims of judicial neutrality, her record told another story. A story of rulings that leaned consistently toward conservative orthodoxy, of decisions that reinforced hierarchy rather than questioned it, of interpretations that narrowed freedoms instead of expanding them. Her confirmation hearings revealed these contradictions in stark relief. Asked about issues that shaped the lives of millions, healthcare, voting rights, reproductive freedom, she dodged, evaded, wrapped herself in legal jargon while leaving the direction of her leanings unmistakably clear. To critics, her silence was not the impartiality of a careful judge but the shield of someone unwilling to be transparent about her agenda. To supporters, she was a champion precisely because she embodied their values without admitting them aloud. Either way, the message was clear. Barrett represented power that refused to name itself while wielding its weight with precision. And then there was her tone. Those who sat across from her often noted it, not openly hostile, but dismissive, as though challenges to her authority were bothersome distractions rather than legitimate concerns. Her clipped responses, her patient but patronizing smiles, her insistence that her worldview was simply fidelity to the law, carried an undercurrent of something sharper, arrogance dressed up as neutrality. It was the arrogance of privilege, of someone who had never truly had her belonging questioned, never been forced to justify her place at the table. This was the Barrett who interrupted Jasmine Crockett, not a neutral observer, not a silent guardian of the law, but a figure accustomed to control, confident in her authority, certain that her status placed her above challenge. In Barrett's world, interruption was not an act of aggression. It was an assertion of order. Her order? The kind that had long silenced those who didn't fit the mold of power. Yet that same confidence was also her greatest weakness. Because beneath the calm exterior, Barrett had grown accustomed to being untouchable. The confirmation that had cemented her seat on the nation's highest court had also cemented a belief that no matter the criticism, no matter the outcry, her authority could not be shaken. Her robes, her bench, her title, they insulated her from accountability in ways few Americans could ever imagine. This is where the contrast with Crockett becomes sharpest. Barrett's authority was inherited from a system designed to protect her. Crockett's authority had been carved out through resistance, grit, and an unyielding refusal to be erased. Barrett's tone dismissed those who opposed her. Crockett's tone amplified those who had been ignored. Barrett wielded her privilege as proof of legitimacy. Crockett wielded her lived experience as proof of truth. To the casual observer, Barrett's interruption may have seemed like a simple procedural move, a momentary clash in a hearing filled with them. But to those who had followed her career, it was a familiar performance. The same restraint that masked ideology now masked disdain. The same calm that once reassured her supporters. Jasmine Crockett did not arrive in Washington as a polished heir to privilege. She arrived carrying the grit of her Texas roots, the weight of battles fought in courtrooms and communities, and the fire of someone who had been underestimated her entire life. Raised in the South, she understood early what it meant to live in a country that measured some voices as worth more than others. She learned resilience not from textbooks or policy seminars, but from lived experience. Navigating the biases that told her she was too bold, too direct, too unapologetic to succeed in the halls of power. Those warnings became fuel. Before politics, Crockett was a lawyer. Her practice wasn't built around high-priced clients or corporate prestige. It was forged in the everyday trenches, defending those who couldn't afford a voice in a system designed to work against them. She took on cases that others overlooked: the poor, the marginalized, the ones who had no lobbyists to speak on their behalf. Her work meant walking into courtrooms where her very presence disrupted expectation, where judges and colleagues often assumed she was the paralegal rather than the lead attorney. Every raised eyebrow, every dismissive tone became another lesson in how deeply bias ran and how much fight it would take to break through. Her battles against voter suppression became a defining feature of her career. Texas, a state where restrictive laws sought to curb turnout from communities of color, was her proving ground. Crockett stood at polling stations where intimidation lingered in the air, where confusion and bureaucracy served as barriers to democracy. She fought to make sure ballots were counted, that the most vulnerable voters weren't erased by technicalities or by design. Each victory was hard-won, each loss another reminder of the forces stacked against her. Yet, through it all, her confidence never cracked. She believed deeply that representation was not a gift handed down, but a right that had to be defended tooth and nail. Authenticity became her armor. In a political landscape littered with rehearsed sound bites and polished facades, Crockett refused to play the role others scripted for her. She spoke plainly, sometimes bluntly, always directly. Her words were sharp not for theatrics, but because she understood that watered-down truth could never pierce the walls of power. To her supporters, this was not just refreshing. It was necessary. To her critics, it was threatening. Either way, it was impossible to ignore. Her rise into public office was far from inevitable. She faced resistance at every stage, the kind designed to wear a person down. Fundraising barriers, whispers that she was too much, the persistent questioning of whether America was ready for someone like her. But Crockett understood something her detractors did not. The very qualities they labeled as flaws, her boldness, her fire, her refusal to defer, were the same qualities that made her indispensable. She wasn't trying to fit into the mold of power. She was breaking it, reshaping it into something that could finally hold the people it had long excluded. Every speech she delivered, every case she argued, every campaign she fought built a deeper reservoir of resilience. That resilience carried her through moments when the spotlight turned harsh, when attacks came not just against her politics but against her very identity. She bore those attacks with a kind of unshakable confidence, not because they didn't sting, but because she understood that they weren't truly about her. They were about the fear she represented, the fear that someone like her could not only enter the halls of power but command them. This is what made her uniquely prepared to face Amy Coney Barrett. Crockett was no stranger to being silenced, interrupted, dismissed. She had lived that reality long before Washington put cameras in her face. But unlike so many who learned to shrink themselves, she had built an entire career refusing to be diminished. When Barrett tried to cut her off, Crockett was not rattled. She had heard that tone before. Judges who assumed her clients didn't matter, lawmakers who claimed her concerns were off-topic, colleagues who mistook her poise for inexperience. Each time she had pushed through. Each time she had found the words to stand her ground. Her authenticity, her fire, her refusal to play by the script of silence made her more than just a politician in that hearing room. She was the living embodiment of every struggle she had carried with her, the fight against voter suppression, the defense of those without a voice, the battle to claim space in a system designed to exclude. And when Barrett's interruption came, Crockett drew from that well. She did not need to raise her voice to prove her strength. Her calm was its own weapon, her silence its own defiance. And in that hearing room, every battle she had ever fought came rushing back, preparing her for this very moment. The exchange began as a ripple, subtle at first. Barrett's interruption had broken Crockett's rhythm, but the representative's calm silence had unsettled the room far more than if she had fired back instantly. Barrett, however, misread that pause. To her, Crockett's composure looked like hesitation, an opening to assert control once more, and so she pressed again. "Representative, please stay on topic," Barrett cut in, her voice smooth but edged with condescension. The words carried the weight of practiced authority, the kind designed to remind the audience who held the gavel and who was expected to fall in line. Yet in the silence that followed, something shifted. Crockett didn't shrink. She didn't bristle. She simply let Barrett's words hang in the air, as though testing the strength of the interruption itself. The cameras caught it, the flash in Crockett's eyes, the brief inhale as she restrained the fire building in her chest. To anyone who knew her, the restraint was more powerful than any outburst could have been. She had every reason to unleash, but she chose patience instead. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was control. Barrett, sensing that her authority had not yet landed as intended, tried again. "This line of commentary is irrelevant," she declared, shifting her tone from dismissal to command. She leaned forward, her posture sharp, her voice steady. But the move only deepened the contrast. Where Barrett grew more rigid, more insistent, Crockett remained composed, unmoved, unshaken, like stone weathering wind. And the audience felt it. The live spectators leaned in. Reporters glanced at one another, pens stilled mid-sentence as though waiting for the crack of thunder after the lightning strike. Online, viewers clipped the interruptions in real time, flooding feeds with commentary. "Why won't Barrett let her speak?" "Watch, Crockett, she's about to go off." The anticipation grew with each passing second. Inside the room, tension thickened. Every attempt Barrett made to diminish Crockett seemed to rebound, exposing not Crockett's supposed irrelevance but Barrett's own desperation to maintain control. The imbalance was glaring. The woman, cloaked in robes of institutional power against the representative who carried her people's truth in her voice. And yet, it was Barrett who seemed rattled. Crockett finally shifted, leaning forward just enough to reclaim the air between them. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't even spoken yet, but the atmosphere tilted. Even those who had come into the room skeptical of her now sensed what was coming. There was no mistaking it. She was about to strike, not with fury, but with precision. The suspense was unbearable. Each second stretched longer than the last. The arrogance of Barrett's interruptions clashed with the unflinching dignity in Crockett's composure, and the collision was about to explode. Then, with the entire room leaning in, Crockett delivered the sentence that changed everything. For a moment, nothing happened. The room froze in a silence so absolute it carried its own weight, like the breath held before a verdict. Barrett's last interruption still lingered in the air, brittle and sharp, but Crockett refused to move, until the stillness had fully settled. Her eyes fixed on Barrett, unblinking, steady, as though she were measuring every ounce of arrogance in the judge's attempt to silence her. The silence itself became her weapon, and the longer it stretched, the more the tension built. Every camera in the room zoomed in, every spectator's spine stiffened, and even the reporters, seasoned veterans of countless hearings, knew instinctively that they were witnessing the start of something unforgettable. Crockett finally leaned closer to the microphone. Her voice was low at first, almost intimate, forcing everyone to lean in. "With all due respect, Judge Barrett," she began, each word deliberate, "the truth doesn't need your permission to exist." The line cut through the room like a blade, sharp, unshakable, undeniable. For a beat, no one moved. Barrett's practiced composure faltered just slightly, a flicker in her expression she couldn't hide quickly enough. The cameras caught it. The audience noticed. And that was all it took. The facade of untouchable authority cracked. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Some gasped quietly, others shifted in their seats, caught between discomfort and awe. Crockett didn't bask in it, didn't pause to revel in the reaction. She pressed forward, her voice gaining strength, each sentence building upon the last, dismantling Barrett's authority not with anger, but with the precision of someone who had prepared her whole life for this confrontation. "You see," Crockett continued, her tone firm but calm, "every time someone like me speaks truth to power, there's an attempt to call it irrelevant. But what you call irrelevant is what millions of Americans call their reality, and I refuse to let that reality be silenced today." Barrett shifted in her chair, her lips pressed thin, the authority she once commanded slipping from her grasp. She tried to interrupt again, but the moment had already turned against her. Crockett's voice rolled on, steady and undeniable, commanding the room in a way that no gavel or robe could. Social media lit up instantly. Clips of the moment hit TikTok within minutes. The pause, the mic drop sentence, Barrett's flicker of doubt. On Twitter, hashtags exploded. "What truth, without permission." Done Crockett clapback. Oh, Barrett exposed. One viral tweet captured the mood perfectly. Barrett tried to shut her down. Crockett just shut down the entire establishment. Inside the chamber, the atmosphere shifted further. It was no longer a hearing. It was a reckoning. Crockett dismantled Barrett's veneer of neutrality with grace and wit, pointing out the contradictions between the judge's claimed impartiality and the impact of her decisions. Each statement was another thread pulled loose from Barrett's carefully woven image. "You claim neutrality," Crockett said, her eyes still locked on Barrett. "But neutrality that always leans in the same direction is not neutrality. It's bias dressed in a robe, and the people watching today know it." The spectators behind her nodded, some even murmuring assent despite the formality of the setting. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing that every word was a headline in the making. Barrett attempted. A small smile, a shield against the blow, but the weakness of it only made her unravel faster. Crockett pressed on, weaving not just an argument but a story. Her story. The story of those she represented. "I've sat in courtrooms where families begged for justice they never received. I've watched voters turned away by laws that pretend to protect democracy but really choke it. And every time I've heard someone like you say it's not relevant. Well, let me be clear. Relevance is defined by the people, not by the powerful." The line drew another collective inhale from the room. Crockett's delivery had shifted now. Measured, yes, but infused with fire. She wasn't shouting, but her conviction vibrated through every syllable, filling the chamber with an energy Barrett could not match. On Instagram Reels and YouTube Shorts, the moment spread like wildfire. Creators stitched Crockett's words into their own videos, praising her courage, calling her the voice of the people. Late-night hosts replayed the clip, adding commentary like, "Barrett's face when she realized she picked the wrong fight. Priceless." Meanwhile, in the hearing room, Barrett's silence deepened. Every attempt to reassert herself fizzled against Crockett's momentum. The once commanding figure was now cornered, her authority stripped bare in the face of Crockett's unflinching truth, and Crockett knew it. She pressed her final point with a calm certainty that sealed the moment. "You tried to cut me off. But let me remind you, Judge, interruption cannot erase reality, and reality is staring you in the face right now." Tihuai. Sentence landed like thunder. The room erupted, not in noise because formal hearings allow no applause, but in energy, in the undeniable sense that a line had been crossed and a new power had emerged. Barrett sat back, her authority deflated, her silence louder than any words she could muster. For the audience, both live and online, it was clear. The tables had turned. The so-called neutral arbiter had been exposed, and the unapologetic truth-teller had seized the room. Crockett didn't just win the exchange, she redefined it. Barrett had walked into the hearing believing her authority was unshakable. By the end of Crockett's counterattack, that illusion lay shattered, replaced by the unmistakable reality that dignity, truth, and representation had claimed their space in the room, and they weren't leaving. The villain had been silenced. The hero now commanded the stage. The hearing had ended, but the battle was only beginning. By the time Crockett stepped out of the chamber, the internet had already detonated. Clips of her mic drop counterattack spread at light speed, reposted, subtitled, stitched, and remixed into 1,000 different formats. On TikTok, users looped the moment Barrett's composure cracked, overlaying Crockett's line with pulsing beats and flashing captions. The truth doesn't need your permission to exist. Within hours, the hashtag #CrocketClapback climbed into the trending column, joined quickly by Chiu Barrett Exposed and Ichiu Truth Without Permission. Twitter became a war zone. Progressive accounts flooded timelines with praise, sharing freeze frames of Crockett's unshaken expression side by side with Barrett's faltering smirk. "This is what fearless leadership looks like," one viral post declared, racking up 500,000 likes in a matter of hours. Grassroots organizers chimed in too. "We've been waiting for someone to say it out loud. Crockett just gave America the rallying cry we need." But not everyone viewed the exchange through the same lens. Conservative commentators scrambled to control the narrative. Right-leaning outlets blasted headlines like "Crockett disrespects judiciary and heated," "Clash," and accused her of grandstanding. They called her words inflammatory, irrelevant, uncivil. Yet even these criticisms carried a strange irony. By amplifying the clip in outrage, they ensured it reached even wider audiences. What they intended as condemnation became fuel for Crockett's growing recognition. Mainstream media couldn't resist the story either. By nightfall, every major cable network had replayed the exchange on a loop. Some anchors framed it as a generational clash, a young, bold congresswoman facing off against the embodiment of institutional power. Others marveled at the composure Crockett displayed under pressure. A few played it safe, suggesting the moment was politics as usual. But the public didn't see it that way. To them, it felt like history, condensed into a single sentence. Celebrities joined the chorus. Ava DuVernay tweeted, "That's how you handle arrogance, with truth that cannot be muted." John Legend called Crockett's words a gospel of resilience. Even unexpected voices chimed in. Athletes, comedians, and influencers with millions of followers clipped the moment and added their own captions. "Say it louder, Jasmine." The memes arrived almost instantly. One showed Barrett's face dissolving into static with the caption, "Connection lost. Truth detected." Another turned Crockett into a superhero figure, microphone in hand like a sword, standing tall against a looming shadow robed in black. Each meme carried the same energy, the thrill of watching arrogance finally get checked. And beyond the digital noise, real-world organizing began to stir. Activists reported surges in donations, volunteers, and sign-ups for grassroots campaigns. Local organizers in Texas said Crockett's words had reignited conversations about voter suppression, community representation, and the silencing of marginalized voices. College students shared the clip across group chats, describing her as the kind of leader we've been waiting for. Parents texted it to their kids, pastors quoted it in Sunday sermons, and teachers replayed it in classrooms as an example of dignity standing firm against condescension. What made the moment resonate wasn't just the clash itself, but the symbolism behind it. Crockett wasn't only defending her own right to speak, she was voicing what so many had lived through, the experience of being talked over, dismissed, told that their reality wasn't relevant. Her one sentence spoke to millions who had carried that same wound. And now they saw it answered with fire and poise. The ripple effects grew wider. Think pieces poured in. Why Jasmine Crockett's clapback matters. The silence that spoke louder than Barrett. When dignity refused to bow. Panel discussions debated whether this was a flash in the pan or the emergence of a new national voice. In the days that followed, Crockett refused to let the moment be reduced to a clash of personalities. She made it clear this wasn't about her. It wasn't even just about Barrett. It was about what happens when power is wielded to silence, rather than to serve, when arrogance tries to masquerade as authority, and when truth is told it has no place at the table. Crockett reframed the moment, insisting it belonged to every person who had ever been dismissed, talked over, or made to feel invisible. "Don't make this about me," she said in interviews. "This is about us. This is about the people whose voices aren't in those hearing rooms but whose lives are decided there every single day." With those words, the viral exchange transformed into something larger, something almost timeless. A parable about truth versus arrogance, people versus privilege, courage versus suppression. The lesson was simple, yet profound. Arrogance can interrupt, dismiss, and belittle, but it cannot erase. Truth, when spoken with clarity and conviction, cuts through the noise. What Crockett embodied that day was not just resistance, but resilience. She stood tall in the face of an authority figure trained to diminish her, and she did not bow. She reminded America that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers with unshakable calm and lands with greater force than a shout. Across communities, that message echoed. In immigrant households, families saw in her poise the reflection of their own struggles to be heard in a country that too often labels them outsiders. In classrooms, young girls, especially young girls of color, saw proof that dignity could disarm condescension, that intelligence could outshine privilege. In churches and union halls, people repeated her line like a mantra. Dignity cannot be muted. Justice will always speak louder than arrogance. Her words became more than commentary. They became affirmation. To those who felt exhausted by the constant churn of politics, this was a reminder of why voices like Crockett's mattered, because they were grounded not in entitlement, but in lived experience. Because they carried with them the weight of generations who had been told to stay silent and chose instead to rise. The moral lesson crystallized in a single truth. When power tries to suppress, courage must stand taller. Crockett had not only faced down Barrett in that room, she had modeled for the nation what it looks like to remain unshaken in the face of dismissal. Her calm was not submission. It was resistance of the highest order, resistance rooted in self-respect, in history, in justice, And so, the moment took on a universal resonance. It was no longer about a congresswoman and a judge. It was about every student told they don't belong, every worker spoken over by a boss, every citizen made to feel invisible by a system that thrives on silence. Crockett had given voice to them all. As the story spread, pride swelled. People who had long felt invisible now felt seen. Those who had carried the weight of silence now felt lighter, their dignity affirmed. And perhaps most importantly, they felt determination. Determination to keep speaking, to keep showing up, to keep refusing to bow before arrogance disguised as authority. In the end, Crockett's legacy from that day wasn't the viral clip, the memes, or even the headlines. It was the reminder that truth does not need permission to exist. It simply needs courage to be spoken. And when it is spoken, no robe, no title, no privilege can silence it. Because dignity cannot be muted. And justice, sooner or later, will always speak louder than arrogance. And so we return to the moment at the heart of it all, the sentence that changed everything. In a single line, Jasmine Crockett transformed a hearing meant to silence her into a stage where truth thundered louder than privilege. Judge Amy Coney Barrett's attempt to dismiss her, to reduce her voice to irrelevance, collapsed under the weight of Crockett's unshakable courage. That's what makes this moment unforgettable. It wasn't just a clash of two women on opposite sides of power. It was a revelation of what happens when arrogance underestimates dignity. Barrett had the gavel, but Crockett had the truth. And the truth is what echoed across America. This is why her words matter. Because in times when power seeks to mute those who challenge it, leaders like Crockett remind us that silence is not an option. Her resilience, her fire, and her unwavering conviction are proof that the fight for justice doesn't happen in abstractions. It happens in real rooms, with real voices, refusing to be silenced. Moments like this remind us why voices, like Crockett's, matter. If you felt the power of her words, if you believe arrogance should never drown out courage, then share this story. Let it ripple outward, louder than the forces trying to suppress it. Subscribe, comment, and add your voice to a movement that amplifies truth louder than power. Because in America, every word carries weight. Every voice holds possibility. And every sentence, even just one, can spark a movement.